Hello, this is my fourth video in a series on dating the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. In the first three videos, I critiqued the documentary hypothesis and argued for the traditional authorship of Moses. And I talked about evidence for the books there being a literary unity written by one person. But I want to take a little bit of a different approach on this one and talk about, instead of just critiquing the documentary hypothesis, I wanted to talk about some positive evidence for these books being written by Moses during his day. So let me share the screen here. Okay, part 4 of dating the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. I want to start in a little bit of a different way and sort of play a little bit of a game here. The question is, where is the writer? If I wrote this sentence, in 48 BC, there was a fire in the great library in Alexandria in the country of Egypt. Now, specifically, is the writer of this sentence in Egypt? Well, actually, I'm the writer of the sentence and I'm not in Egypt. But even if you didn't know that it was me, the statement that says in the country of Egypt should be a little bit of a giveaway. Because if you did live in Egypt, you would just say Alexandria. And since that's one of the largest cities in Egypt and a very famous place, that's all you'd say. You wouldn't include the phrase in the great country of Egypt, in the country of Egypt. Or to put it a little bit of a different way, where is the writer? If I said, in 1871, there was a great fire in Chicago in the country of the United States. Well, actually, I wrote that too, but that probably sounds a little clunky to you because why would anybody say Chicago in the country of the United States? In this case, the writer is in the United States, and I think probably most people watching the video are, so that sounds a little awkward. Is the writer in the United States? Well, yeah, but that's what makes the whole sentence awkward. If this was written in South Africa for a history of firefighting class for firefighters in South Africa, then the sentence is no longer awkward because you might need to say that Chicago is in the United States. But if we're living in the United States, it's a little awkward. So given that background, what about this verse? In Genesis 23, it says, after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, east of Mamre, that is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. So, is the writer in the land of Canaan? Well, once again, if the writer was in the land of Canaan, that would be a little awkward to say Hebron in the land of Canaan, since Hebron's one of the larger cities in there. And this isn't the only time that that happens. About 10 chapters later, it says, and Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. Once again, Shechem is one of the more prominent cities. So why do we say in the land of Canaan? Is the writer in the land of Canaan? Well, it's not totally conclusive, but I think that this is evidence that the writer is not in the land of Canaan. And specifically, Moses is not in the land of Canaan. You might remember Moses, he never got there. He lived in Egypt. He went with the people and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, but the Lord did not let him pass in. He never entered the land of Canaan. He knew some about it. He was educated, but he never got in there. So when he was writing about it, he was writing about it from the outside. That's why it says in the land of Canaan. The people he was writing to knew even less about it than he did. But another whole point is, why say the land of Canaan at all? That phrase appears 51 times in the Torah. Why always Canaan and not Israel or Judah? If this was written later, you would probably be more likely to refer to the land of in the land of Israel or in the country of Judah. But the reason I think that they say land of Canaan is because the Israelites were not there yet. It was the land of the Canaanites. Later on, the Canaanites would be almost extinct in that area, but at this time, it's still the land of Canaan. Okay, what about places? What places does the writer really know? Well, he lists some Egyptian cities there. And then when he's talking about something in the land of Canaan, the area of the Jordan River Valley near Sodom, he says, it's like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. Well, that's the kind of city that's written to people who might know a little bit about Zoar. Of course, the later Israelites wouldn't have a clue about what Zoar was, but they knew what the Jordan Valley was. But this isn't more evidence that the writer knew about Egyptian things. He knew that Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan, an Egyptian city. Once again, I think the later Israelites would not have even heard of Zoan. The writer knows about wilderness places. In Numbers 33, the writer lists 51 places that they traveled to in the wilderness. And in Deuteronomy 1, he lists some more. What place does the writer not know? Well, he doesn't know about Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, of course, becomes such a prominent city, far more prominent by very, very far than any other city in the Old Testament. It's mentioned 667 times, but not even once in the Torah. And the reason is because it wasn't a big thing in the Torah. Moses may never have heard about it, may never have known about it. So this is evidence, I think, that this is all written well before Israel actually, certainly before Jerusalem became their capital, probably before they ever even entered the Promised Land. Here's a picture from, it's a screen clip from, you might recognize it, the movie The 10 Commandments. And little baby Moses has been put into a basket and it's picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. So the question is this safe? This passage says about Moses' mother that when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Well, so I think I would be worried about that on several levels. Like, are there crocodiles out there? But in any case, the one thing that she's not worried about is she's not worried about the river being too violent or tipping over. In the Nile River Delta in Egypt, that would be very tranquil and you wouldn't have any worry, at least, about the basket tipping, which is not like what would happen in the land of Israel, where the rivers are steep and run fast, and you could not put a baby in a basket. So the writer just knows that that's okay. The writer knows lots of things about Egyptians. The writer knows that Egyptians don't like sheep. On Egyptian reliefs, archaeologically, you can find a lot of pictures of cattle, but never sheep. The writer knows that Egyptians embalmed their dead. They embalmed Jacob and later Joseph. Israelites never did that, but the writer knows that Egyptians do. The writer knows that Egyptians made bricks with mud and straw. I didn't write it on here, but the writer also knows that the Egyptians could just irrigate by pushing around water with their feet or whatnot. And he points out that in the land of Canaan, they're going to have to rely on rain, which is unlike in Egypt where you get very little rain, but you get plenty of water from the Nile. The writer knows about the Egyptian diet. They had things like leeks and onions and garlic. All these things are things which would be prominent in Egypt, but not in Israel. And the writer knows about the Egyptian tax rates, believe it or not. It says that Joseph's 20% land tax is a law until this day. And one wonders, what day is this day? This day is probably the day that the writer is writing that book. And the reason that that's notable is because Moses, being raised in Egypt in the royal family, would probably know what Egyptian tax rates were. And it's possible that Joseph's rate could have lasted for quite a while until the time of Moses. It isn't too likely that this would have been exactly still in place many hundreds of years after Moses, though. This is a picture of an Egyptian relief there And the figure that's a human figure with a giant ball over his head, that's really the sun. So this is a picture of the Egyptian sun god Amun-Re or Ra. He actually goes by several different names. The thing about the Egyptian gods is that the stories of the plagues against Egypt, the 10 plagues, are very much a judgment marked against the Egyptian gods, because almost really every plague kind of, in addition to just being a plague, it seems to target one of the Egyptian gods or the capabilities of the gods or the things that they're supposed to do. And I'm not going to read through this table here, but you can freeze the image or whatever and compare and see the list of the different plagues and the particular god that is being targeted. The next to last one there was against Ra, the sun god, who was maybe one of the main Egyptian gods. And the 10th one was more of a plague against Pharaoh as an Egyptian god, because there was some belief that the Pharaoh was divine. There are warnings against other gods in the Torah, and who do they warn against? Well, they warn against the Transjordan false gods. In other words, the false gods which were worshipped on the east side of the Jordan River, like Moloch and Chemosh. They were Moabite gods. You're not supposed to make your children pass through the fire to Moloch. It was kind of a child sacrifice thing. Baal Peor really means Lord of Peor. They had trouble with him in one of their stories. But what God is missing from the list, I mean, not judged in the plagues and not warned against in the Torah, not warned against was just the Canaanite god Baal, the thunder god, which turns out to later be such a scourge for first northern Israel and then southern Israel. But the Torah doesn't warn against Baal specifically. I mean, it warns against any other false gods, but the people at that time in Egypt and in Transjordan, apparently that wasn't the temptation at that time. Now, I'm not going to talk in any of my slides very much in any of my presentations on linguistics, because it requires a little bit of a knowledge of Hebrew. In my book, I had a great deal on linguistics and the Egyptian influence on Hebrew as it was formed in the Torah. So I'm not going to talk about that much, but I just wanted to introduce a couple things to give people a little bit of a feel for that. In Hebrew, they have what's called a dual, and that's like in English, you have singular and plural. In Semitic languages like Hebrew, you have singular and plural, but you also have a dual form if there's two. So that's not unique to Hebrew. The other Semitic languages also have a dual form. Well, to make a word plural in Hebrew, you end it with im, but to make it dual, you end it with ayim. The word for Egypt is Mitzrayim, so it's dual. You can actually see that word untranslated in Genesis 10:6, because he's the grandson of Ham, grandson of Noah, the son of Ham. In the King James Version, and I think a few other versions, it just leaves it as Mitzrayim. There are a few other languages, a few other translations which actually translate that to Egypt. But in any case, that's the Hebrew word for Egypt. Now, the other Semitic languages all use the same sort of beginning, MZR, for Egypt, but it's only in Hebrew that it's dual. And there's a reason for that, and that's that the Egyptians at that time considered their country to be two lands. The Pharaoh was the Pharaoh of the two lands. Egypt was the two lands being the upper and lower Egypt. So it was considered to be a dual country. And that kind of influence apparently made it into Hebrew, though not into the other Semitic languages. It made it into Hebrew because the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. Shemayim is also an interesting word that is dual in Hebrew, because this is the word that's translated as heaven or heavens. And because it's always in dual form, in English, sometimes we're not quite sure whether the translation is best to say heaven or heavens, singular or plural. But in any case, The Egyptians had a belief that there were two heavens, one that passed over the rule of the realm of the living and one over the realm of the dead. And so that may have influenced the Hebrew wording there too. And then also in my book, I list a number of names in the Torah which were probably Egyptian names. And I won't go through all of them here, but I will suggest one maybe. Moses. Is Moses an Egyptian name? Well, Moses, the name has a lot of similarities to Pharaoh's daughter said, because I drew him out from the water. But also it has a similarity to some other royal Egyptian names, Ramses and Tutmos. Look at the letters and look at the consonants. So Moses himself might have an Egyptian name. The setting for the Torah is in the camp. It's not addressed to people who are living in cities or who are very well settled. It's addressed to a people who are in a camp, like the children of Israel while they're in the wilderness. There's a pillar of fire that goes before the camp and lights it up and leads them, and they move when the pillar of fire moves, and they stop when the pillar of fire stops. And things happen inside the camp or outside the camp or on the edge of the camp. Everything's identified as far as location in reference to where the camp is. There's detailed instructions about how to camp, a whole chapter about it, and a whole lot of information on how to decamp, how to leave the camp, how to make the tabernacle mobile, and everything that they were making, like the Ark of the Covenant and all the other instruments. There were instructions about how to make them with rings that you can stick a pole through and pick them up and carry, because all of this stuff that they used for worship had to be able to be mobile and be transported around. And there's numerous references to things that must be done outside the camp. So the Torah is addressed to a people who are not settled in the agriculture, farms, or cities. It's addressed to a nomadic people moving around. And finally, I want to talk about briefly eyewitness characteristics. Now, this is very subjective, so you can draw your own conclusion. Maybe you may not feel exactly the same way that I do, but some of the Torah, I think we would want to say that it reads like it has an eyewitness characteristic. For example, Exodus 15:27 tells you that there were 70 palm trees and 12 fountains. Somebody counted the trees. What does manna taste like? Numbers 11 tells you what it tastes like and different ways that people cooked it. To me, it sounds sort of like an eyewitness account. Or how about this verse? You know, Israel is fighting the Amalekites, and the people seem to notice that Moses would lift up his hands, and as long as his hands were lifted up, they would be winning, but when he put his hands down, they would be losing. So they decided it all sounds a little superstitious, but so they had Moses, you know, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat down on it, and they had this one guy on one side hold up one of his hands, and another guy, we don't know much else about him, but he's on the other side, and he held up the other hand. And so they held his hands up till the sun went down. It sounds a little bit, at least to me, it sounds a little bit like an eyewitness account. And then finally, on the eyewitness thing, there's the repeated reference of so many things that they were told that they need to remember. Remember, you were a slave. Remember what the Lord did to Pharaoh. Remember, the Lord led you these 40 years. Remember how you provoked the Lord. Remember the day you came out of Egypt, all the days of your life. Now, in a religious setting, I think we should say that there's always some value in trying to remember, so to speak, spiritually, even if you weren't part of the experience. As Christians, when we take the Lord's Supper, part of the reason we're doing that is to remember the Lord and remember his death. That's part of the reason. So it's not completely invalid to tell people maybe many years later that they need to remember something that was really just experienced by their forefathers. But you begin to wonder if we're overdoing it a little bit, if that's all the reason we're doing it. Remember the day you came out of Egypt? You know, there's a lot of people when something specifically that was a big news day happens in your life, you sometimes talk to other people and say, I remember where I was when that happened. Um, so that makes good sense for people who actually experienced it. Eh, But and then there's other things like remember what the Lord did to Miriam on the way. And then there was a reason for him to say that to the people at that time. But do we really need to remember that today? Yeah, I mean, when was the last time we sang a hymn about what the Lord did to Miriam? It's just not the sort of thing that we feel it would normally be very important to remember. Or remember what the Amalekites did. Well, you know, hundreds of years later, who really cares what the Amalekites did? You know, it's kind of like telling me that I need to remember what the Iroquois Indians did. I'm not sure it's that important. Now, to the people at that time, that was actually going to be important because the Amalekites attacked the Israelites. They were going to be a nuisance and a hazard. And some years later, uh, the Lord had Saul attack them and destroy the Amalekites. But by the time you get to the later kingdom years, the Amalekites were different history. They were deep in history. Why do we have to, why would a people much later have to remember what the Amalekites did? Well, anyway, I think that that's probably also evidence for an eyewitness character to the Torah. I realize that that is a little subjective, but and anyway, that's about the last thing I'm going to mention in this video. I'm going to have one more video on dating the Torah. And in that video, I'm going to talk a little bit about Genesis because the situation with Genesis is a bit different from the other books in the Torah. Genesis was older. Moses was not an eyewitness to it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why Genesis is a little different and then sort of wrap up the whole summary of dating the Torah. So thank you for watching. I will stop sharing the video and I will shortly come back with another video.